Okay, let's talk about the seafloor, chapter 18. First off, let's kind of talk about the sea and where it came from. So the sea, the oceans around this planet, that water came from somewhere. That's something we don't really think about, but as the solar system was originally coming together, somehow water got on this planet. Did it just kind of come with all the rocks and it just kind of seeped out, or was it brought in from somewhere else? And as time has gone by, I've seen this question sort of answered in different ways as new research has kind of come out and been revealed. But generally, the idea is that a lot of it has potentially, if not most of it, come from comets. And as comets fly by the Earth, they actually have a little bit of water ice that's attached to them. In fact, they're mostly water ice. Comets are actually have a composition that's H2O. But as they fly by Earth, they'll actually deposit a little bit of water. And earlier in the solar system, there was a lot more comets than we have today. But if you kind of run through the deep time math that I've sort of taken you guys along with, you can imagine that, let's say a comet goes by once a year and dumps a gallon of water on the Earth. Well, over a million years, that's a million gallons. Over a billion years, that's a billion gallons. And that's not necessarily how much it is, but that's just an example of how just a little bit over time can sort of snowball. However, some of the water is likely just from volcanic degassing, just from the Earth kind of differentiating itself over time. But certainly comets have played a part, and whether it's mostly comets or mostly the Earth, I think is something we need to go look at, and that the answer to that question may actually change in 5 or 10 years, depending upon what we discover and what we find out. So there's a comet, yay! So you can see that. I mean, you can see the tail of the comet. This is all ice that's vaporizing off the comet as it's getting closer to the sun. Anyway, so that's where the water comes from. What about the rocks? So this is what we really care about. What's going on the sea floor? Well, first off, we have to figure out how to study the sea floor, and there's a lot of different ways that we study the sea floor. We can use rock dredges. So basically, you just drop a big old bucket down there and dredge things up and figure out what's down there just by bringing it up to the surface. There's drilling, like this little drilling ship here, where you can actually drill down, take core samples. I'll show you what those are in a second, and look at it that way. Or we can use submersibles. I've got a whole bunch of friends who work on what's called the Okeanos, which is a NOAA research vessel, and they have ROVs, robotic vehicles, that they pilot underneath the water and go down to the bottom, and we'll study all sorts of features, from stuff that's extremely deep in the ocean, geologic features, to finding new types of species, to also exploring, shipwrecks. Also, there's ways we can indirectly observe the ocean floor. This is techniques like sonar and seismic reflection profiling. And seismic reflection profiling, or seismic surveying, is something that the oil industry uses very heavily, and there's been a lot of technology that's been put into that, and it's generally how we know what the ocean floors look like, or what the subsurface on the ocean floor looks like. So here's just a myriad of different ways you can study the seafloor indirectly. You can use an echo sounder, so you're basically just using sonar, swath bathymetry, so basically you're using potentially lasers, and you look at the reflection of the lasers and the distance they travel, and you can map out the bottom of the ocean floor that way. You can use these smaller submersibles to use these similar technologies, and you just attach them to this smaller thing. And then there's this seismic reflection, which is where you have this sound source and it creates, supersonic, boom, 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 or whatever it does. And that actually penetrates the bottom of the ocean and will reflect. And if you listen on it, or if you have a whole bunch of hydrophones you've attached to the back of your ship, they'll pick up those return signals and based upon what those sound waves, what those seismic waves are what they look like and the timing of them, you can tell a lot about the subsurface of the ocean. And this is something the oil industry does, and it's how we find oil, off in the Gulf of Mexico. And generally, this is kind of how it works. You have some sort of source that's creating shock waves. You tow behind you a whole bunch of hydrophones. So when you see a seismic ship, usually there's a huge net of hydrophones that it's trailing behind it. But as those seismic waves reflect off of different rock beds underneath the ocean, or even off of oil or water or salt or whatever it may be, based upon those waves and how they change. And we'll talk about earthquake waves a little bit later on, and this may make a little bit more sense when we get into how we listen, how we look at waves that happen with earthquakes, because the waves themselves have properties and based on frequency and amplitude and things like that. But anyway, this is kind of how we figure out what's underneath the bottom of the ocean. This is actually some real data of what you get back, and you can actually take courses, usually in grad school. There's courses that are entirely dedicated to understanding seismic data, but honestly, if you've ever done those, what were they called? Like these crazy eye books or whatever, you could buy these books and you kind of put your nose on the page and you slowly pull them away, and it looks something like this, and then all of a sudden, a picture of a cat appears or whatever. This kind of looks like that. But if you're sort of trained on how to look at these, and normally you actually look kind of down one side to help you identify features, but I can tell just by looking at this, these are actual beds, geologic beds, underneath the surface here, and it's not hard for you to follow along that little, that bright blue bed right there. Maybe that's a sandstone or something. And there's also faults in this region. I can tell there's probably a single fault that kind of travels right here. Looks like there may be another one right here. But this is kind of what the seismic data looks like when you get it back and plot it out. Here's another sort of representation. The faults are actually drawn in here, and they've colored in a couple of rock beds to kind of show exactly where they are. So another thing you can do is called core sampling. So basically, you got a little drill rig on a ship here. You send down a little drill bit that's on the end of a drill pipe, and you drop it all the way through the water. And this ship has super fancy propulsion systems to kind of keep it in place, so the boat doesn't rock around, and so you're not wiggling your drill pipe, in 2 miles of water. But anyway, you can put this down, you can get it down to the bottom of the ocean, and you can start drilling through the rocks. And you can actually get core samples where, as that drill goes, it actually lets some of the rock pass through it, and you get these. You take a core of the bottom of the ocean, and you can see how the sediment might change. You can see the changes in color here. This might be really sandy, where this is a lot of clay, and then clay back to sand, back to clay, back to sand, back to clay, and there's something weird right here. Maybe that's some fossils, and etc. So, what kind of features do we see on the seafloor, and what kind of different types of seafloor do we see? Something I've talked about a lot, even since the beginning of class, are the margins of continents. When we talk about plate tectonics, there's 2 types of continental margins, the edges of continents. You've got passive continental margins and active continental margins. Passive continental margins are where you have oceanic plate meeting up with the continent, and it's just pushing it along. That oceanic plate's not subducting underneath the continent. Where in active continental margins, that's typically what you see, where you have an oceanic trench, where you have an oceanic plate that's meeting a continent, and that oceanic plate's getting pushed underneath the continent. And then we also, out in the middle of the oceans, have these mid-oceanic ridges where oceanic crust is being created. So here's kind of that idea in the generalization. So mid-oceanic ridge, you have these little mountain chains and a little rift valley in the middle where the magma is kind of coming out. and you have these plains, and you have a slope and a shelf. So this is kind of a passive continental margin. There's no trench over here. And over here, you have an active continental margin, and they've thrown in some seamounts. You could also have seamounts over here, but there's the trench, and that means this plate's actually getting subducted underneath this piece of continent. So here's an example of a passive margin. The east coast of the U.S., there's no subduction trench. You've got the oceanic plate, it's meeting up with the continental plate, and it's just kind of pushing it along. There's definitely something right here, but this is just the continental slope. There's not an actual trench right there, just kind of a steep slope. And this is the continental shelf. But passive continental margin. For an active margin, you have subduction. This is Japan over here, and there's China and Russia, so this is Asia. And you can see this trench that actually goes along here where the Pacific plate is being subducted underneath the continent. And Japan is actually the result of this oceanic plate being subducted underneath, and then it melts and you get an arc of volcanic islands. But active continental margin, you see lots of volcanoes along active continental margins, and these deep, deep trenches. This is the mid-oceanic ridge. So over here we have Africa, over here we have South America, and you can see this ridge system kind of zigzagging along that exists at the bottom of the ocean. And this is where oceanic crust is being created. The rocks around here are typically basalt, and they are very, very young along this little ridge system. So as these volcanoes along this rift are erupting down at the bottom of the ocean, they're creating new crust. This crust is then being pushed out that way and pushed out this way. So as you get closer to the oceanic ridge, as you get closer to it on both sides, it's younger. As you get farther away from it, it's older. And here are some seamounts. Here you have Hawaii over here, and all these little dots are seamounts on the bottom of the Pacific plate. Almost certainly caused by volcanoes that have now subsided underneath the ocean's surface. If these little seamounts are above the surface, we typically call them islands. So features we see on the seafloor, there's continental shelves and continental slopes. I kind of mentioned that. Continental shelf is usually an extension of the continent. The water above it is fairly shallow, and then you have a fairly steep continental slope that drops off of it. And the steepness of this can change depending on where you're at, and this is kind of an exaggeration. And if you actually go out into the real world, it's even then it's kind of a gradual thing. But when we exaggerate it, like you see on Google Earth, you can really kind of tell there's these spots that are far steeper than the continental shelf. So here's Gulf of Mexico. So you can see really well the continental shelf over here by Florida, and then there's this slope where it goes deeper into this abyssal plain. A little bit awkward right here where the slope is a little more gradual. This has a lot to do with actually salt domes. Maybe we'll talk about that when we get into geologic resources, or somebody will present on oil and gas and talk about the salt domes in this area. But again, you can kind of see the continental shelf and then the slope, and you're down into deeper water. During the last ice age, when you had a lot of the Earth's water was trapped into glaciers and sea levels were lower, these areas were actually land because the water was shallow enough. But this part of the Gulf of Mexico is definitely still covered in water. So because you have kind of these continental shelves and slopes, there is sort of a weird dynamic that occurs along these slopes, and it's not all that different than the erosion and deposition that we see on land. It's just kind of happening a little bit underwater, and you'll end up getting these abyssal fans that are kind of like the alluvial fans we see in desert areas coming out of mountains. You'll get these turbidity currents where they will carry a whole bunch of sediment that kind of come rushing down these steeper slopes. And those turbidity currents can create a graded bedding that we see if it ends up getting preserved later on. And yeah, so bigger picture, submarine canyon. It's kind of flowing out of here and creating this abyssal fan. All this stuff's kind of unconsolidated. It's not rock yet. It's a lot of sand, a lot of silt, a lot of mud, and it just flows fairly easily out here over time. When you get currents that develop along these areas, they'll kind of dig out this canyon and create these little flows of sediment. So on passive continental margins, you'll get these continental rises. Continental rise. Oh, that comes up to kind of meet the continental shelf. Sorry. And these are just areas where the sediment has kind of come off the continental slope and the continental shelf and collected over time. I think I blew this up. There we go. So there's kind of this continental rise. So it's kind of making this continental slope a little less steep. I'm not that concerned that you know about this. It's not that crucial of a thing. And the abyssal plains are just the extremely flat areas off of the continental rises and off the continental shelves. On active continental margins, you don't see that same sort of thing. You get more oceanic trenches, which can be very, very deep, on the order of 10 miles deep, possibly. And along these edges, where you get oceanic crust being pushed underneath the continent, you'll end up getting these Benhoff zones. I think I said that right. Where you have a zone of earthquakes. So I'm going to start talking about earthquakes here a little bit later. Because again, I'm kind of jumping ahead. This is chapter 18. It's kind of assuming we've already talked about earthquakes, but I like talking about this first before we get into earthquakes. But you get earthquakes in these zones down here because these plates are rubbing against each other. And you can get volcanoes. When this plate gets subducted, it melts and we get volcanoes. Ta-da! So mid-ocean ridges, they're fairly important. Not only are they the drivers of kind of continental drift, because they're kind of pushing the continents around in a way, or affecting at least how the continents kind of migrate around, but also they are a habitat for life, and it's something we discovered not all that long ago, on the order of decades ago. And now, as far as the history of life is concerned, we believe that modern life sort of started, or at least was sort of incubated, and in these regions of the deep ocean. Why? Well, if you imagine an Earth, we've talked about the early Earth before and how it was just kind of a mess, right? The early solar system was very dynamic. There was a lot going on, things flying around, running into each other, hitting each other, getting asteroid impacts. If you live on the land and a big 10-mile wide asteroid hits the planet, or let's say it's a 50-mile wide asteroid, something huge, something that actually melts a lot of the crust and vaporizes off, a lot of the water and just creates huge tsunamis, huge fires. It's just terrible, terrible, terrible. Where's the best place for you to survive? Down here. In deeper parts of the ocean, where you have an energy source through all this hot water and all this hot material and mineralogy that's sort of coming up, and you don't rely on sunlight. If you rely on sunlight, then you're at the mercy of anything that happens at the surface, but down here, it's a little bit easier to survive. And we see this in modern day where fish and animals that live in the deeper parts of the ocean can sort of be considered living fossils. There's something called the coelacanth, which was just discovered not all that long ago off the coast of Africa. We thought they were extinct. It looks like a fossil fish. But it turns out they had actually survived in the deeper parts of the ocean, because if you change the climate really quickly on the surface of the planet, that'll affect things that live near the surface. But if you're living down here deep in the ocean, it's a lot harder to kind of change the environment from changes that happen on the surface. But anyway, the reason we think life started here is kind of a genetic thing, and it's kind of outside the purview of this class, but if you want to go learn about it, feel free, and I encourage you. It's pretty fascinating stuff. To kind of think that bacteria and life sort of potentially started, or at least was harbored down here for quite a while. But today you can go down there and look at this stuff, and it harbors these communities of animals. There's mussels, there's crabs, there's tomb worms, and there's no sunlight down here. It's very deep under the ocean, and so there's no photosynthesis, but there's these huge communities of animals that can survive down there. I've honestly wondered myself if there was ever a time period on Mars where these could have existed. And if we're going to look for life on Mars, maybe we should look for areas where we can find sort of fossilized evidence of these things. Anyway, so other features we see fracture zones. So here we have mid-oceanic ridge, and there's these fracture zones. So there's the ridge over here. So this is moving that way. This is moving that way. And over here, this is moving that way. And this is moving that way. There's just these crazy fracture zones that kind of split up the ridge along these mid-ocean ridges. And there's these transform faults. And there's also seamounts, which are just islands that have dropped beneath the surface of the ocean due to erosion and possibly subsidence. But moving into that, let's talk about reefs. So when you get these seamounts and these islands that are generated by volcanoes, if they stay up above the surface enough, life will find them and start to develop reefs around them. Reefs are formed by, typically today coral, not always. Through geologic history, it hasn't always been coral. There's actually been reef systems that were dominated by mollusks, by clams. And these huge, huge, huge colonial clams that actually created reefs, and not coral. But the coral is very dependent upon sunlight, and the ecosystems that exist around reefs depend upon sunlight. So they sort of need something to attach onto. So you need an island sticking above the ocean where you can get close to the surface of the ocean so you can get sunlight. But what will happen is you'll get a volcano that comes up, and the reef will start to develop around it. Over time, that volcano possibly stops erupting and starts to erode and subside. Well, the reef can stay there for a while. It sort of builds up on itself, and it can maintain a small little ring of an island where a volcano used to exist, and we call these atolls. If you look at Hawaii, they're more younger islands, like the Big Islands. The Big Island, this is not Hawaii, but the Big Island doesn't have much for reefs around it. There's very little white sand beaches around the Big Island. There's some, but not nearly as much as the older islands where the reefs have had a couple more million years to develop and grow. And then when you get farther and farther down the Hawaiian Island chain, eventually the volcanoes have completely eroded down or eroded away, and all you have are these island atolls. So if you go way up the Hawaiian Island chain, you get out towards islands like Midway. So if you're familiar with World War II history, the Midway Island is actually a piece of the Hawaiian Island chain. But all that's left now is a coral reef atoll. There's kind of two types of sediments when we kind of look at the seafloor. There's the terrigenous sediments. Sometimes you'll hear terrigenous clastics. So this is all the stuff that we've typically talked about when we talked about sedimentary geology, right? We talk about clastic stuff. It's stuff that's coming off the continent. And there's also pelagic sediments, which settle slowly through the ocean water and are derived from fine-grained clay delivered primarily by wind. So this stuff's kind of, this is your sands, your silts, your clay, or even gravel, and they're coming off the continent from the rivers. Pelagic sediments are the stuff that get way out into the open ocean and will just settle. And maybe it's clay that's been pushed along by an ocean current, or maybe it's, as it says here, delivered by wind. You blow a whole bunch of silt off the coast of Africa, and eventually it'll settle in the middle of the ocean. And over long periods of time, this sediment will collect, and you'll get a little bit of sediment sitting on top of your oceanic crust. So, what if I were to tell you that you can sometimes get oceanic crust chucked up onto a continent? So not always when we have oceanic crust meeting continental crust will it always get pushed underneath. Usually it does. But sometimes you can shave off little upper bits of that oceanic crust, and we see that preserved on continents. And when we see that preserved, we call them ophiolites. And it's a certain rock sequence, and based upon that rock sequence, we think, oh, this stuff was oceanic crust. And it starts with a little thin marine sediment, and then there's pillow basalts, so eruptive basalts like volcanic basalt. Then you have these crazy basalt dikes, and then you get this intrusive gabbro. And then down beneath you might get ultramafic rock, so even darker, greener stuff, things like olivine. But when we find this on the squished up on the surface of a continent, we'll call it an ophiolite. You can find this on the western part of the U.S. The western chunk of the U.S., kind of west of the Rockies. A lot of that was created by small island arcs that keep getting banged into the continent. Like the western part of the U.S. is just this accumulation of collision after collision after collision. It's like a 9-car pileup, but the pileup wasn't 9 continents. It was like 9 bicycles. It was much smaller pieces of land, and sometimes it was actually oceanic crust that got pushed up onto the land. That's a pretty good analogy. I'm going to have to remember that for later. So, because oceanic crust usually and eventually gets subducted, it's not very old. It'll appear at these mid-oceanic ridges, it'll get pushed to the edges where the continents are, and eventually get subducted. The oceanic plates are mafic, they're heavier than the continents, and it's why the continents kind of float up on top of them. The continents are the lighter material, it's the felsic stuff, it's the granite, it's the feldspar, and these are just lighter minerals than the mafic minerals that we see making up oceanic crust, like basalt or olivine, which have a lot of iron in them. But this whole idea of mid-oceanic ridges creating magma, creating lava, and pushing out from these ridges to create oceanic crust, this was the explanation. Like once we realized that, once we started taking, age dating the sea floor and realized, oh man, this is what's going on, then we kind of had the mechanism for plate tectonics. We understood that, okay, now we understand why South America fits into Africa so nice and neat, And we've gone through this stuff before. So that's it for this chapter. Yeah, if you have questions, ask me.